What does it take to leave the well-paved road of academia and instead forge a career in science communication? My guest today trained as a biochemist and computational biologist, but along the way discovered her voice through science storytelling, mental health advocacy, and eventually the world of biotech journalism. She's now a senior editor at Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. She covers some of the most exciting frontiers of science, from AI in protein design to breakthroughs in drug discovery, translating complex research into stories that resonate. We'll talk about her path from lab bench to newsroom, the courage it takes to step off the familiar path, and her advice for anyone looking to build a career that blends science, creativity, and impact. This is the Discovery Arc podcast. I am Drew Duglin, and today let us welcome Fay Lin. I am very curious about your sort of origin story and your kind of initial passion for science. So can you tell me about that? And was the writing also sort of first and foremost, or did that kind of come later?
So, in terms of science, I would say I was exposed to science in pretty early on growing up as a kid. So, I grew up in an immigrant household. My dad actually came to the US. I grew up on Long Island, New York, because he was starting his PhD. And so, when I was growing up, I actually saw the academic path going from grad school to postdoc to faculty position. It was something that was introduced to me early on and something that was very familiar. And particularly, I think, growing up in an immigrant household, something that was familiar in a country where there were a lot of things that were not familiar. And so science research in that respect was something that I was exposed to early on. And in terms of just resources for high school students, we lived near a local university. So there were a lot of university resources that supported the youth in growing a science path. And I would describe this as there was an environment that really cultivated a scientific background. But I think it's really interesting the way that you use the term passion, because I actually wouldn't really describe my early interest in science as a passion. There was something about science or something that was there that struck my interest, but research early on, I knew, just thinking about one research question and focusing on that over weeks, over years, etc. That didn't quite call to me. And so there was this dissonance between there's something about biology, there's something about the way that problem solving, there's something about how things work that drew my interest, but also research wasn't quite the best fit. You mentioned the writing. When did the writing come into the picture? Well, I would say that as a student in high school, I would say English and biology were actually my strongest subjects, but it was figuring out how would those two things blend together that would ultimately become that journey that I was going to go on, because at the time there was really no paved path in terms of science communication. It was either what I saw going to the faculty route, becoming a scientist, or in terms of the writing, didn't really see a lot of exposure to people doing science writing. And so I would say early on there were a lot of introductions into this is science research. There's something right here. I don't know if they could really mesh together.
So how did you figure out what your sort of science background was going to be? You had the interest in bio. It seems like later down the line, you got involved in computational biology for grad school. So what kind of led you down that path, sort of interest wise? And yeah, pretty good foresight getting involved in the computational side.
Oh yeah, I think also adding some color into just the area of journalistic coverage I do today, which is a lot focused on AI and drug discovery, and a lot of that was driven by going through a lot of these, I guess, the coursework when it was a time of this sort of interdisciplinary computation and biology, these sort of more interdisciplinary focused courses where we're just starting. And in terms of biology and computation, a big part of the motivation for computation was, well, this is something that could be more employable. This is something that is does extend beyond biology research to have a skill set that has a reach beyond, working with cells, working with test tubes, et cetera. And so being in undergrad, kind of deciding what direction I wanted to go in, I think I was really colored by, again, coming back to this immigrant mindset of going somewhere that is paved, somewhere that is a bit familiar, because it does give you a sense of safety. And, actually in undergrad, I did spend my freshman year writing for the school paper and trying to figure out if journalism was a way that I wanted to go in. And ultimately it became something that was an interest. I ultimately decided to pursue the biology major coursework, eventually go to grad school. But I did have this early inkling of maybe writing was something that I could pursue as a career. But I think the picture that I would paint early on is that very more logistically, what is paved, what would get me employable, what felt safe. And a big part of my journey, I think, later on was trying to define, well, is that going to give me fulfillment?
I mean, you said, you had that sort of interest and some earlier experience, in journalism, but what were the sort of the signals or turning points during the grad school path that you made you think, well, actually, I think I could pursue a science communication career and choose the unknown path?
Yeah, so I think of so there's one really specific, I felt like, turning point in my grad school career that really introduced me to science communication. And I went to UCLA, and at the UC system we have this basically the 3-minute thesis competition, what they call in the UC system the grad slam. So what that is that students basically make a presentation, 3 slides, 3 minutes, and you have to make it accessible to someone who does not have any uh, experience in science, right? So it's really the science communication exercise where you have a time limit, you have a slide limit, and also you're trained every day to give group meetings and talk to folks who only study your particular problem every single right day in their research. So how are you going to really flip that on its head and give a presentation that's going to be accessible to people outside of your lab? And so I remember entering this competition, and maybe because we're out in Los Angeles, there's Hollywood, it's a place where they give a lot of investment into presentations. But I remember giving this, there's this final round in which we this was pre-COVID, but this was live streamed, that we were like in an auditorium. And also there was this just, I guess, great audience that showed up to watch all of these grad students present their 3-minute presentations. That when I was, on the stage giving my presentation and just seeing people really interested in what I was saying, and also afterwards coming up to me and asking questions about, oh, like, tell me more about this immune system code that you you had like very much teased in these 3 minutes that you were up here. I think being in a position where it really contrasts from, being a scientist, doing your own work, and just less of a people facing role to just being on stage and having this audience and seeing the engagement and seeing how interested they are in what you're saying. And I think it was really having a lot more conversations and people facing interactions that made me really invigorated and really excited to talk about the science that I was doing in a way that, doing group meetings just never quite achieved.
Yeah, that's such a cool environment that you were in. And yeah, if there's one thing that Hollywood does very well, it's storytelling and the narrative arc. So, there's a lot of that need in science. And I think those lightning talk sort of setups are really good for distilling the core concept. So did you get much sort of formal guidance at the time there as a grad student on these alternative career paths? Because I know, me included, and a lot of people going through this, it's like they have the same challenges, and it's not necessarily, a good guidance or alternative paths that people could choose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big challenge in academia is just finding folks who have branched out and learning their story and how they got there. And so I would say in terms of just general resources. I think nowadays we do see a lot of resources for going into the industry, like becoming a scientist outside of academia, but going more to these exciting biotech companies and startups, and a lot of more industry focused roles. And I would say that was a resource when I was in grad school as well. But in terms of science communication, I finding resources and communities that really had that interest, I would say was something that slowly unfolded over time for uh, myself. And I think the grad slam, was my first step into finding other grad students who were interested in this type of work and finding that community. And then the next step in terms of finding resources was, after the grad slam, of course, we're all on social media. We're all excited about who won or who, what stories people gave. And I really remember distinctly that someone came up to me after this grad slam and said, I saw you on Twitter, you like gave this presentation, this 3-minute thesis. And I was like, I'm on Twitter. like, like what? It was just this really interesting moment where this was before I really, started my journey into social media and communications. And I remember that moment as really a turning point to say, I'm going to make a Twitter account because apparently I'm on Twitter. so, yeah, it was really, I think a theme that I would pull out from my journey is that there's a lot of like snowball effects, and just, doing this one competition, there was a lot of things that it showed me in terms of science communication, but also an introduction into broader communities, and that eventually ended up becoming social media. But it was a very um, interesting just how one experience could really, lead to a lot of other downstream effects.
And actually, part of that experience, I know you've mentioned in the past, being involved in sort of mental health awareness for other grad students. So, yeah, can you kind of tell me more about that?
Yeah, no, happy to. I think this is something I'm really passionate about. I would say, that entry into Twitter also snowballed a handful of other advocacy efforts, and particularly with a focus on um, mental health. And so, I did the grad slam that was a science focused uh, project, but I think it also empowered me to just have my voice out there in other respects, and in particular, with the thinking about mental health in graduate education, there are a lot of factors that make it very difficult for grad students to have a healthy environment. So one being there's this big power dynamic between advisors and students, where advisors can really dictate graduation timelines, and just also dictate just the environment that you're in without being held accountable for holding environments where grad students are able to thrive. So one, there's that power dynamic. And then two, in the sciences, there's a lot of underrepresentation. It's still very white male dominated. There's a lot of, still systemic discrimination that happens in academia. That is another factor making it difficult for this to be a really healthy place to be. And then, I mean, the other overall thing is that, I think over time we are seeing more dialogue about mental health and normalizing talking about it, and having spaces where it is safe to speak about things like depression, anxiety, etc. But stigma is still a thing, and I think a big part of me finding my communication voice was really honing into, well, what are the topics in which we need open dialogue on, and what are the topics in which we need to talk about in order to really not only support student well-being, but down the road this is something that is going to support our science, and just how we move forward in all of our exciting projects that we are here to ultimately push forward. And so in terms of the advocacy, when I was finishing my PhD, it was also during the COVID, where a lot of these conversations were at the forefront, and people were going online because we were seeking community, and everyone's social distance, and conversations were really happening on social media. So there was really this mix of external factors that came together that made particularly, mental health dialogue something that people were very actively giving attention to. So yeah, I just started with a few tweets on just how calling out things like power dynamics, calling out things like, I've experienced depression, and that's something that I think we need more people to say out loud and to have other people feel seen in, and to say it's something where environments need to take accountability for how they impact folks, and it's any sort of mental health struggle shouldn't be seen as a weakness and should be more normalized, and we need more people to speak out about it. And so eventually I think grew a large platform with, I think, over like 15,000 or so people following my rants on Twitter. My hopefully productive rants on Twitter. Um, and from that also snowballed a handful of opportunities to, whether it be doing podcasts or doing more written work or other communications opportunities that allowed me to speak more on this topic that ultimately also gave me some more professional skills.
Wow. So it feels like, you had the storytelling aspects that you were sort of exposed to and interested in. You had some writing background, and then you got, very involved on the public facing side with Twitter at the time. And so how did you make the transition then to, your foray as a full-time kind of independent writer? Was it all those things together? What was it that kind of landed you the job? How did you make the change?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I know I go back to this, passion is a journey and trying to figure out where all the pieces land in this conglomeration of experiences, that we all um take together over time. So I ended up graduating with my PhD, I believe, a little after, either around the pandemic or like at the time where at least my defense was still virtual, right? We were still kind of in the tail end of getting out of pandemic state, and so now all of a sudden I'm also looking for, my next opportunity after grad school. And I remember, one, after all this mental health communications work, I did build a nice community of folks at the intersection of science and communications that were very helpful in terms of getting resources and finding those job postings that I could apply to. And I think one thing I would say is that having a community of folks and people who have similar interests is very powerful to help anyone go to the next stage of their career. And so that was very helpful to lean on in terms of finding that next opportunity. So I eventually landed in this really unique position to launch this peer review journal we called Gen Biotechnology. So this launched in 2022. And specifically, they were looking for someone ideally with a PhD background who could serve as a peer review journal editor, not only to look for reviewers and to review manuscripts and to do everything I imagine a peer review editor to do, but also take on a more shaping role of, this is a new journal, who's going to be on the editorial board? How are we going to get content for a journal that doesn't exist yet, and a lot of that editorial strategy? And so this was really a unique opportunity that popped up right when I graduated. And it ended up where I landed next. And with any job search, there is this, I think, combination of timing. Just, I think something specifically like science communication, where there's so many amorphous type of titles out there. It's so different what you can be doing. I mean, one, it was really exciting to have something where I could still take on a more, I suppose, technical PhD level work, but interact with communications in a way that was now doing editorial strategy. Um, and so I would say in terms of definitely timing, but also I think having a track record of communications experience was something that positioned me well to find opportunities like that and become a good candidate for an opportunity like that. And that's was all how that first step came together.
It's so interesting because a lot of people think, oh, I could get into maybe journal editing, but it's completely different when, wow, you're just jumping into setting up a whole new journal.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. I think it was such a unique role that was very much what drew me to it was so much of the building aspect of something new and having support from uh just folks who have launched these things before, and to be part of something from the beginning where you do have a lot more freedom in shaping just scope and who you want to be on the board. A lot of this, I've really learned over time. I think having the creative freedom to shape the story is something that really does resonate in terms of overall communications work.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree that creativity is really, really satisfying. So, how long did you stay in that for before you sort of deviated towards, what you'd say sort of more core science journalism?
So yeah, I mean, I really had the pleasure of joining a company that Marianne Liebert, who has a portfolio of not only peer review journals, but who the magazine platform that I currently write for, Genetic Engineering Biotechnology News. There's also this news magazine platform of ways in which news writing for the scientific field, whether it be covering the latest Nature Cell Science paper or latest announcements from biotech companies, having a more newsy platform to talk about those announcements specifically for the scientific community. So it was really exciting to be in a environment that had so many different facets to communication. So I started out with peer review journal publishing, and writing was maybe a smaller proportion of my role, and was in this more peer review journal focused role for, I would say, a couple of years, maybe over 3 years or so. And then it really gave me an opportunity to figure out there's so many different ways to engage with science publishing specifically. Do you want to be more of an editor, just handling the writing from scientists and helping them tell their story? That's one avenue that I predominantly started out in. But then over time, I realized, I really like just taking the pen and paper and being the person who is out there interviewing scientists, and being the one who is creating the story that they want to have told, and being more of a writer role. And so over time, I had the opportunity to kind of explore both of those areas, and realizing that writing is something that gives me a lot of excitement to take ownership of a piece of work, and to say I'm the one who is going to be the artist, right, in this situation. And so I currently am a full-time journalistic writer at Genetic Engineering Biotechnology News, focusing particularly on AI in drug discovery, and leveraging a lot of computational background to cover the computational landscape. But also with that, there's so much exciting things happening in biotech, from just CRISPR, cell and gene therapy, organoids. You name it. There's so much out there to cover. That's this is a broad landscape that we all cover.
Yeah, yeah, I know you've been covering a lot. I've seen of AI in sort of protein design lately, and sort of in general. What are you seeing in terms of exciting biotech advances that you've been covering, where you're thinking, "Wow, like the future is like arriving much faster than we sort of expected."
I mean, there's so much hype in reality when it comes to talking about AI these days. And I think the visual that I've heard a lot of experts describe is, we're on this inflection point of this exponential, right, technology curve, and really making sense of what is the technology, what is being accelerated, and what are realistic timelines for if it is getting a drug to the clinic. How far are we from these tools really making an impact in clinical development, right? So yeah, I mean, protein design is something that I've actively, probably my most favorite shows for my writing, but my favorite area of coverage, to be honest. And a lot of that does come from doing a PhD, where my program was actually in biochemistry and molecular structural biology. So I did kind of tap my hands into just protein modeling, and just this was also pre AlphaFold time. So having seen the field go from just more of these like biophysical, we're modeling specific atoms, to now, machine learning and just seeing the protein structure prediction problem pretty much, people would call it pretty much solved at this point. I think it was seeing that transition as I was going through grad school that made me have a closer relationship to talking about protein design, a greater appreciation for how significant it is to see, right, the Nobel Prize in chemistry being won by David Baker and Demis Sabbis and John Jumper. And so I think a big part of that interest comes from just, having that scientific background as a writer and really appreciating that trajectory. And, I mean, in terms of just like the excitement over protein design, there's a lot of talk of designing proteins from scratch, de novo protein design. And I wrote a longer article earlier this year, kind of unpacking, what is hype and reality over designing proteins from scratch.
And so when you are writing about these things, now you've been doing it for a number of years, when you're taking a cutting edge, sort of highly technical biotech story, trying to translate it for sort of a broader audience, yeah, what's your process kind of look like? Like, where do you start?
Yeah, and I think what's really exciting, particularly about Jen, is that we speak to a scientific audience, and so I do still get to stay close to some jargon and to say results and statistics and numbers, and people aren't turned away from that. And I think me as a writer being able to interact with science still on that technical level is really exciting. So with that, when I write stories, interview scientists who are at the forefront of this research and who have a very, in terms of the articles, a very science forward way of reporting. And so I would say, my confession is I'm not an expert in everything, all of these topics that I pursue and write about. And I think the exciting part of doing journalism and the process is the interviews, is getting out there and finding the folks who are on the front lines, day to day, growing these cells, seeing it not work and seeing it work and being really excited about it that, oh, this binder is, synthesized, it's sticking, and seeing that excitement on their face in this interview and being able to translate that onto a page. I would say really the core of the process that really drew me to science communication is this people facing opportunity where I get to talk to all types of different researchers and not only understand the work that they do on a technical level, but also who they are as people and how they got there and what was it like day to day, finding these collaborators and what was it like when you got that first result, et cetera. I mean, I think every conversation is different. Everyone brings something different to the table, whether it be anecdotes or just, the nitty gritty science that they find exciting. But a big part of the process is really getting to know people and just being that active listener and making their stories come to life based on, what they can tell me.
And sort of on a related note on what they can tell you, and this is sort of selfish as well, but say you are a scientist or like me, you're in science communications for, a company or an organization. How should we be pitching sort of journalists or science writers to kind of get them interested in the work?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think key question for anyone working in PR. So, yeah, I mean, I think it also depends on just who the target audience of the person that you're targeting to. So, I mean, I can speak for Jen's audience, which is predominantly scientists, and obviously, what is the significance on the impact of the field? Putting that into context, what has been done before, and how is this, a significant advance from what was done before? Thinking like a scientist, right? Like what's the gap, and what are you trying to address? And I would also say that for the science journalism, I think there is this hunger for more human stories. And so, there's types of stories where you're reporting like a paper that was published and more newsy type of article. But then there are also these, insightful interviews that you have on, the story of the scientists and how they came to become interested in their field and just more of the who are they, right? This human aspect. And so I think, I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the audience that you're targeting and exactly what uh, type of format that each individual writer is trying to pursue. And I think there are different ways for a story to resonate.
Yeah. So, when you're not science writing, what else are you up to? What other kind of hobbies or passions do you have?
Yeah, I try to be a person who's more than just a science writer. So, I'm out in LA. I am a big cat person, I would say. I have a 2-year-old black cat. His name is Spencer, and he's my partner in crime. And so a huge, huge cat fan. But also, I think thinking more in terms of how it informs reporting. I actually wrote this fun article on a cat clinical trial in cell therapy actually the other week, and so you're thinking about centering the cats and also how in terms of reporting playing a role not only in talking about just the human landscape, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of telling that veterinary narrative as well. And but also out here in LA, we don't really have seasons. There's so much outdoorsy things that we do out here, and I'm trying to be more active in terms of going to these national parks, particularly when we do have the pleasure of not being confined by snow and rain. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, lots to see and do, and yeah, big cat fan. Also, we have a tuxedo, and he's snoring away in his in his tower right now. So, I guess I'll just ask you my final wrap up question now, which I like to throw at all my guests, which is if you could give your one piece of advice or wisdom in the area of work or productivity, growth, health, relationships, really anything, what would it be and why?
I go back to this idea that a big part of my journey was veering off of the paved path, right? So I think what really resonates with me is not following the crowd and not following the crowd. Don't do something because it's easy, just because there's this external order because something is paved. That still may give you a lot of internal disorder, right? Which is what I experience in terms of finding what I eventually called a passion, right, for science communication. That early on, I just wasn't sure what that could have looked like, and so I would say my guiding compass is to really take ownership and to shape a path that maybe you do not see yet, but there are communities out there who will support you. There are new opportunities out there that could snowball into eventual just more discoveries about yourself or more opportunities and just yeah, just go off the paved path even if does take a lot of courage.
I love that. Yeah, it's funny. Like we were saying before, yeah, a lot of people will follow that sort of externally ordered path that brings internal disorder, like you were just saying, versus something that looks externally disordered, but is actually going to bring you internal harmony.
Well said.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. All right. Where should people follow you, Faye, if they want to see what you're up to online?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently writing for Genetic Engineering Biotechnology News, so definitely read everything that we have on there. So that's genengnews .com, I believe. So in addition to the protein design stuff that I cover, plenty of exciting stuff overall at Gen. Um, I am on LinkedIn and on formerly Twitter still. Probably can drop some users in the show notes as well to point to, but plenty of socials that people can find me on, and also more writing to be done at Gen.
Definitely. Yeah, we'll throw those in the show notes and really appreciate your time today and telling your story.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Drew.